In the archives of the London Metropolitan Archives on Clerkenwell Close, there is a photograph that has been catalogued and publicly accessible for over a century. It measures approximately 18 by 24 inches in its original print, and it shows a work crew standing inside what would become Baker Street Station in 1862. The photographer was Henry Flather, a British documentarian born in 1839, who would go on to produce some of the most detailed visual records of underground railway construction ever made. The men in the photograph are holding pickaxes and shovels. Behind them rises a wall of exposed brick, not rough-cut stone, not packed earth, not the clay and gravel that official geological surveys describe as London's subsurface composition. Brick, formed brick, laid in courses, extending upward beyond the frame of the photograph into darkness. The caption beneath this image reads, "Navvies excavating the Metropolitan Railway, 1862. The operative word is excavating, not constructing, not building, not assembling or erecting or laying, excavating. And for a century and a half, no one in any official capacity has explained whose bricks those are." The official history of the London Underground is among the most thoroughly documented civil engineering narratives in the Western world. The Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground passenger railway, opened on January 10, 1863, running from Paddington to Farringdon Street. The project was proposed by Charles Pearson, a solicitor for the City of London and a tireless campaigner for urban reform, beginning in the 1840s when the congestion of horse-drawn traffic through central London had become a crisis that the city's infrastructure could no longer absorb. Pearson had calculated the prohibitive cost of demolishing London Yard by yard in order to build railways above ground, and his elegant solution was to build cut and cover tunnels beneath existing or improved roads. The project was funded through a combination of private investment and municipal bonds, with the City of London eventually taking £200,000 in shares in 1859 after years of financial difficulty and parliamentary resistance. Construction was carried out primarily through what engineers call the cut and cover method. This method, as described in every textbook and museum exhibit and engineering manual of the period, involves digging an open trench from the surface, laying track at the bottom, and then covering the trench with a roof, either brick arches or iron girders, to restore the street above. The labour force consisted of approximately 2,000 navvies, itinerant manual workers who had previously built Britain's canal and railway networks across the countryside, working with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, and horse-drawn carts. The entire 3.75-mile route was completed in approximately 3 years of active construction. The engineering plans, the financing records, the parliamentary debates, the newspaper coverage, the private correspondence of the engineers and investors, all of it survives in extraordinary detail across multiple archives and institutional collections. There is no mystery about the London Underground. It is perhaps the most publicly scrutinized infrastructure project of the 19th century, and yet the images do not show what the documents describe. The through line of everything that follows is a single visual element that appears in image after image from the Metropolitan Railway excavations, an element so persistent and so unexplained that once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it in every visual record from the period. It is the arch, not arches built by Victorian workers as part of the tunnel construction. The documents carefully record that process and the brick arches of the finished tunnels are well understood and fully accounted for in the engineering specifications. What appears in the excavation images is something else entirely. Pre-existing arched structures, buried beneath street level, exposed by the work crews and incorporated into the railway infrastructure rather than constructed by it. These arches appear in records from Baker Street, from King's Cross, from Farringdon, from Paddington. They appear in engineering drawings that mark them as found conditions rather than planned construction. They appear in the private correspondence of engineers who describe encountering them with language that suggests surprise rather than expectation. And they appear not only in the records of the original Metropolitan Railway, but in the photographic documentation of the Metropolitan District Railway that followed 5 years later, as though the same buried infrastructure extended beneath an entirely different section of the city. This second point requires elaboration because the photographic record has been persistently misattributed in ways that obscure its true significance. Henry Flather, the photographer who captured that early image at Baker Street in 1862, went on to produce a remarkable series of 64 photographs documenting the construction of the Metropolitan District Railway, a separate company and a separate route that opened its first section from South Kensington to Westminster in 1868. These photographs, now held by the London Museum, show construction activity at Notting Hill Gate, Gloucester Road, Bayswater, along the Victoria Embankment, and at numerous other sites across a wide arc of central and west London. The significance of this expanded body of work is considerable. If the arched structures visible in the 1862 Baker Street photograph were merely local anomalies, remnants of a single demolished building perhaps, or the cellar of a particular warehouse, then they would not appear in photographs taken 6 years later at sites miles away. But they do appear. The same curved brickwork, the same vaulted geometry, the same precisely fitted blocks extending into unexcavated earth on either side of the construction trench. Flather documented these features with the methodical eye of a professional whose assignment was to record construction progress, not to investigate archaeological mysteries. He photographed what was there, and what was there, again and again, was brickwork that no one had built. The official explanation for any such structures is straightforward and reasonable. London is an ancient city built on layers of previous construction. Roman walls, medieval cellars, Tudor foundations, Georgian basements. The subsurface of any city with 2,000 years of continuous habitation contains remnants of previous building. When the Metropolitan Railway engineers encountered old structures, they documented them, worked around them, or incorporated them where useful. This is standard archaeological and engineering practice. This is unremarkable. The archaeological record of London is rich precisely because construction projects have been finding buried structures for centuries. Roman mosaic floors beneath office blocks, medieval plague pits beneath car parks, Tudor timber frames beneath Victorian warehouses. There is nothing anomalous about Victorian workers encountering old brickwork beneath the streets of one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. But this explanation does not account for the scale. The structures visible in the excavation images are not cellars. They are not foundations. They are not the fragmentary remains of previous buildings demolished and buried over centuries of urban development. They are intact tunnel systems, complete with finished walls and vaulted ceilings, extending laterally beyond the boundaries of the railway excavation in both directions. In the well-known engraving of the construction works at King's Cross, published in the Illustrated London News in February 1861, not a photograph, but a detailed wood engraving of the kind that the ILN's artists produced from direct observation at construction sites. The excavation trench is depicted at approximately 33 feet wide, consistent with the engineering specifications recorded in the Metropolitan Railway Company's own documents. On either side of this trench, the exposed walls of pre-existing brickwork continue unbroken until they disappear into the unexcavated earth at the margins of the illustration. The brickwork is uniform. The mortar joints are consistent. The arch curvature follows engineering principles that suggest intentional design for load-bearing capacity, far exceeding anything required by a basement or cellar or any domestic or commercial structure of any period. These are not remnants accidentally uncovered. These are cross-sections of something much larger, something whose full extent was never mapped because the railway engineers were not archaeologists and were not paid to ask questions about what they found. They were paid to lay track and meet deadlines, and they did both with remarkable efficiency. The Illustrated London News deserves particular attention because it represents a different category of evidence than photographs. The ILN employed skilled artists who visited construction sites and produced detailed engravings based on direct observation. These engravings were published for a readership that included engineers, investors, and members of the public who passed by the open construction trenches daily, an audience that would have challenged any fictitious depiction immediately. And what these engravings consistently show across multiple issues and multiple sites is brickwork that extends beyond the planned excavation boundaries, arched forms that were exposed rather than constructed, and structural elements described in the language of discovery rather than creation. It is worth pausing here to consider the specific vocabulary that recurs throughout the documentary record of the Metropolitan Railway construction. The word excavation appears with overwhelming frequency. The word clearing appears in maintenance logs and engineering reports. The word uncovering appears in private correspondence. These are words of removal, of revelation, of exposing what already exists beneath a surface layer. They are not the words of construction. The vocabulary of construction, building, erecting, assembling, laying, constructing appears in the documents primarily in reference to the fitting of tracks, the installation of platforms, the construction of station buildings at street level, and the placement of ventilation shafts. The underground structures themselves are described almost exclusively in the language of discovery. This linguistic pattern is so consistent across so many different authors and document types that it cannot be attributed to the stylistic preference of any individual writer. It reflects a shared understanding among the people who were actually present at the excavation sites, an understanding that they were finding things underground, not building them. The next fact requires you to examine something everyone has encountered, but no one has questioned with the rigor it deserves. The cut and cover method, as described in every official source, means digging a trench from the surface downward through whatever material lies beneath the streets. This requires removing a volume of soil, rubble, and debris equal to the dimensions of the trench, multiplied by its length. For the original Metropolitan Railway route of 3.75 miles, with trenches approximately 33 feet wide and averaging 20 feet deep, the total excavated volume works out to approximately 300,000 cubic yards of material, according to the railway company's own engineering estimates. This material had to go somewhere. Victorian London had no motorized trucks, no conveyor belt systems, no mechanical excavators, no steam-powered earth-moving equipment that could operate in the confined spaces of city streets. Every cubic yard was lifted by hand, by men with shovels standing in the trenches, filling buckets and barrows that were hauled to the surface by ropes and pulleys and occasionally by horse-powered cranes. Then, loaded into horse-drawn carts, transported through the streets of the city and deposited at designated spoil sites outside the urban core. The logistics of this operation deserve to be understood in their full dimensions. A standard horse-drawn cart of the 1860s could carry approximately 1/4 of a cubic yard of loose earth per load. The number of cart trips required, calculated from the Metropolitan Railway's own engineering estimates preserved at the National Archives in Kew, was approximately 1.2 million individual loads over the 3-year construction period, roughly 1,100 cart movements per day, every day, for 3 continuous years. Each trip required a route through streets already congested to the point of crisis. The newspapers of the period complained constantly about the disruption. The railway company had to negotiate with every property owner along the route. Every element of this logistics chain is documented across municipal records, parliamentary testimony, insurance claims, and property damage lawsuits. What is not documented anywhere is where all that soil actually went. The spoil sites listed in the Metropolitan Railway records, primarily marshland near Hackney Marshes, low-lying areas along the Thames below Greenwich, and exhausted brick earth quarries, received deliveries during the construction period. The volumes recorded at these sites, calculated from surveyor reports and landowner compensation claims, account for approximately 40% of the total excavated material. The remaining 60%, roughly 180,000 cubic yards, appears in no surviving record. It is not listed at any documented spoil site. It is not recorded as sold or transferred. It simply does not appear in any ledger or receipt after leaving the excavation trenches. For a project this thoroughly documented, this carefully audited by investors and Parliament, the disappearance of more than half the physical output of 3 years of labour represents either the most spectacular accounting failure in Victorian engineering or something else entirely. Consider what 60% of an excavation volume actually means in physical terms. 180,000 cubic yards of London clay and rubble is not a quantity that can be quietly mislaid. It is approximately the volume of the Royal Albert Hall. The idea that this quantity of material was excavated, transported through the most congested streets in the world, and deposited at unknown locations without any surviving record in an era when every penny was scrutinized by shareholders and Parliament strains the limits of what administrative incompetence can plausibly explain. Victorian civil engineers were meticulous record keepers. The Metropolitan Railway Company employed dedicated clerks whose sole responsibility was tracking material flows. The accounts were audited annually and presented to shareholders, and yet more than half the excavated material simply vanishes from the documentary record. The possibility that emerges from this discrepancy, the reframe that the evidence quietly suggests, but that no official source has ever stated plainly, is uncomfortable in its implications and radical in its consequences. If the spoil volumes documented at receiving sites do not match the excavation volumes calculated from the documented dimensions of the trenches, there are only two possible explanations. Either the records are systematically incomplete across multiple independent documentary sources maintained by different organizations with different incentive structures, which is possible but would itself require explanation, or the actual volume of material excavated was substantially smaller than the official dimensions of the trenches suggest. And if the actual excavation was smaller, then the images from the construction period begin to make a different kind of sense, a kind of sense that no one has previously articulated in any official or academic forum. They were not digging tunnels, they were clearing them. The Metropolitan Railway workers, in this reading of the evidence, were not construction labourers creating underground infrastructure from raw earth. They were excavation crews removing accumulated fill, centuries of silt, rubble, compacted debris, and urban detritus from pre-existing passages that had been buried beneath the streets of London for an unknown period. They were exposing structures that lay beneath a relatively shallow layer of accumulated material, structures with finished walls and vaulted ceilings that required not construction, but cleaning, not building, but revealing. The cut-and-cover method, rather than a construction technique for creating new tunnels, becomes, in this reading, a description of uncovering, cutting through the surface layer of accumulated fill to reach what lay beneath, and then covering the exposed passages with the appearance of new construction to fit them for their new purpose as a railway. The brick arches in the images are not anomalies to be explained away as temporary shoring or coincidental remnants of demolished buildings. They are the actual subject of the images, hidden in plain sight by captions and accompanying text that tell you what to see instead of what is actually there. This would also explain the financial miracle of the Metropolitan Railway, a miracle that economic historians have noted, but never satisfactorily explained. The original projected cost of the railway was approximately £1 million. The actual cost came in remarkably close to this figure, a feat of budget adherence that was virtually unprecedented for a major infrastructure project of this era and remains unusual even by modern standards. Contemporary projects of comparable scale, the Thames Tunnel, Brunel's Great Western Railway, the various London Bridge projects, routinely exceeded their budgets by 50 to 200%. Infrastructure projects in dense urban environments, where every yard of progress requires negotiation with property owners, relocation of utilities, management of groundwater, and accommodation of ongoing street traffic, are the most expensive and the most prone to cost overruns of any construction type. The Metropolitan Railway should have been the most expensive of all. It was built beneath the busiest streets of the world's largest city. It crossed beneath major buildings, beneath sewers and water mains, beneath the Fleet River, which ran underground through a brick-lined channel that the railway had to pass beneath without disturbing, and it came in on budget. The usual explanation for this remarkable economy is that the engineers were simply very good at their jobs. John Fowler, who served as the chief engineer, was indeed a brilliant and experienced railway designer. But no amount of engineering brilliance explains how you dig a tunnel beneath the most expensive real estate on Earth for the same cost per mile as laying track across open farmland. Unless the digging was substantially less extensive than the official account suggests. The Fleet River intersection deserves particular attention because it illuminates a crucial aspect of what the railway engineers encountered underground. The Fleet is one of London's so-called lost rivers, a substantial watercourse that once flowed openly from Hampstead Heath to the Thames at what is now Blackfriars. By the time of the Metropolitan Railway construction, the Fleet had been progressively enclosed in a brick-lined underground channel over the preceding 2 centuries. The railway route crossed the path of the Fleet near Farringdon, and the engineering challenge of passing a railway tunnel beneath an underground river without disrupting either structure was considered one of the most formidable obstacles of the entire project. The solution devised by the engineers involved constructing an iron trough to carry the Fleet over the railway tunnel. In effect, an underground aqueduct bridging an underground railway. This solution worked, and it remains in service today. But what is interesting about the engineering drawings for this section, preserved in the Metropolitan Railway Company's archives, is that they show the Fleet's brick-lined channel intersecting with other brick-lined passages at the crossing point. Passages that run neither along the path of the river nor along the planned path of the railway. These additional passages are marked on the drawings with annotations that translate roughly as existing structures and are drawn with a different line weight than the planned construction, indicating that the draftsman understood them to be found conditions rather than elements of the design. No subsequent investigation has determined what these passages were, where they led, or who built them. The railway engineers noted their existence, worked around them, and moved on. The passages remain beneath Farringdon, presumably in the same condition they were in when Victorian workers first exposed them to gaslight in 1861. Before you dismiss this as the fever dream of someone who has stared at old engravings and photographs too long, follow the specific evidence, not the theory, not the speculation, not the narrative framework that I or anyone else might construct around the evidence. Follow the evidence itself, the volumes that do not reconcile across multiple independent documentary sources, the structures that extend beyond the excavation boundaries in image after image from multiple photographers and illustrators working at different sites over a period of years. The engineering drawings that mark certain features as existing conditions rather than planned construction using standard drafting conventions that any engineer of the period would have understood. The language of excavation and clearing and uncovering, rather than construction and building and erecting, that appears in document after document, image caption after image caption, engineering report after engineering report, as if the people who wrote these words knew something they were not quite able or willing to state directly. The question is not whether Victorian engineers built the London Underground. Clearly they did, in the sense that they made it operational, fitted it with tracks and stations and ventilation and lighting and all the infrastructure required for passenger service. The question is what they found when they started digging, and why the answer to that question has been sitting in the archives for 160 years without anyone stating it plainly. The visual evidence extends beyond Flather's work and beyond the engravings of the illustrated London News. Numerous photographers documented the Underground Railway during and after construction for various purposes: promotional materials, engineering records, journalistic illustration. Many of these images are held across the London Metropolitan Archives, the National Archives at Kew, the Science Museum, and private collections. Across this distributed body of evidence, the same elements recur. Arched passages extending beyond the frame, brickwork of uniform quality exposed by construction crews, walls too clean and too structurally sophisticated to be remnants of demolished surface buildings. These elements appear in images taken by different people at different sites on different dates. They cannot be attributed to the bias of any single image maker. They are simply what was there. The arches wait in those images, patient and unexplained, curving into darkness on either side of every frame. They waited beneath the streets of London before the Metropolitan Railway existed. They were there when the first navvy drove his pick into the surface layer of accumulated fill above them. And perhaps they are waiting still in sections of passage that were never incorporated into the railway network, sealed and forgotten behind walls that Victorian workers built not to create new passages, but to close old ones that led in directions the railway did not need to go. The question of why this evidence has never been systematically investigated is not a question of conspiracy or deliberate suppression by shadowy authorities who know the truth and are hiding it from the public. It is a question of categorical architecture, the invisible scaffolding of institutional mandates, funding structures, disciplinary boundaries, and professional incentive systems that determines which questions receive serious attention, which anomalies receive investigation, and which patterns remain forever outside the frame of legitimate inquiry. Understanding this architecture is essential to understanding why the curved brickwork in those Victorian images has never been subjected to rigorous independent analysis, why the financial discrepancies in the Metropolitan Railway's accounts have never been forensically audited by economic historians, and why the geological impossibilities documented in the construction logs have never been reconciled with the official narrative of excavation through London clay. Academic funding in the United Kingdom operates through a system of peer review that rewards incremental advances within established paradigms and systematically excludes questions that challenge foundational assumptions. This is not a criticism, it is a description. A geology professor at Imperial College, or UCL, who proposed investigating pre-existing tunnel structures beneath London, would not receive funding. They would receive career damage. The proposal would be categorized as pseudoscience before a single measurement was taken, not because the evidence had been evaluated, but because the question falls outside the boundaries of legitimate inquiry. Peer reviewers would assess the category of the claim, find it incompatible with established understanding, and reject it without examining the evidence. This is the normal operation of a system designed to maintain coherent disciplinary boundaries. The cost is that certain questions become structurally impossible to ask. Transport for London, which inherited the tunnel network, maintains it as operational infrastructure, not as a subject of historical investigation. Their mandate is safety, efficiency, and passenger throughput. There is no budget category for historical anomalies. There is no maintenance protocol for investigating pre-existing construction. A maintenance engineer who reported that a section of tunnel wall appeared to predate Victorian construction would not trigger a research program. They would trigger a review of their professional judgment. The institution selects for personnel who see what they are expected to see and categorize their observations within the existing taxonomy of known conditions. This is not suppression. This is the ordinary functioning of large organizations optimizing for their stated mission. The British Geological Survey operates under analogous constraints. Their geological maps of the London Basin are masterpieces of scientific cartography. But a tunnel is not a geological feature. It does not appear on geological maps. The question of whether certain underground structures predate their accepted construction dates is an archaeological question, not a geological question, and falls outside the survey's mandate entirely. The specific technology that could settle this question exists and has existed for decades. Ground-penetrating radar can differentiate between disturbed and undisturbed soil with centimeter-level precision, can identify excavation boundaries, can detect voids and sealed passages behind existing walls, and can reveal whether surrounding clay was cut to accommodate a brick wall or settled around it over a much longer period. A comprehensive GPR survey of the original Metropolitan Railway tunnels would answer definitively whether the surrounding geology shows evidence of mid-19th century disturbance or patterns consistent with centuries of contact. Such a survey would take approximately 6 months of night shift access and would cost roughly £800,000, trivial compared to Transport for London's annual maintenance budget. The equipment is standard. The methodology is established. The technical capability is not the barrier. The barrier is categorical. No institution has a mandate to ask this question. Transport for London has no funding category for anomalous archaeology. University departments would face professional consequences for proposing such research. The question falls into the gap between institutional mandates, not rejected, simply unaskable within any existing framework. Thermoluminescence dating of the tunnel bricks would provide an even more direct answer. This technique measures the accumulated radiation dose in ceramic materials, revealing when the brick was last heated, which is to say, when it was fired. The technique can date ceramic materials within a margin of approximately 50 years. A single brick from a wall that the engineering drawings mark as an existing condition, subjected to thermoluminescence analysis at any equipped university laboratory, would reveal its manufacturing date with sufficient precision to confirm or refute the official narrative. If the bricks date to the 1850s or 1860s, the period when the Metropolitan Railway was under construction, then the official narrative stands confirmed, and this entire line of inquiry collapses into an interesting but ultimately incorrect reading of ambiguous evidence. If they date to the 18th century, they might represent remnants of Georgian infrastructure, which would be interesting but not paradigm-breaking. If they date to the 16th century or earlier, the entire framework of London's construction history requires fundamental revision, and the question of who built the tunnels beneath the city, and when, and why, and how the knowledge of their existence was lost, becomes one of the most significant archaeological questions in European history. The cost of such an analysis is approximately £200 per sample. The time required is approximately 3 weeks from sample delivery to result. The methodology is so standard, so well established, so routinely applied that it has been used to authenticate Renaissance ceramics, detect art forgeries, date Bronze Age pottery from Mesopotamia, confirm the manufacturing period of medieval tiles from cathedral floors, and verify the provenance of archaeological finds on every continent. It has never been applied to a single brick from the London Underground. No one has applied it because no one with the authority to extract a brick sample has a reason to ask the question. A private researcher cannot access the tunnels. A transport engineer has no mandate for historical investigation. An archaeologist has no jurisdiction over operational infrastructure. A geologist would face professional consequences for proposing the inquiry. The question sits in the gap between disciplines, visible to anyone who looks but actionable by no one with institutional standing. This is not conspiracy. This is the ordinary geometry of how knowledge is produced within institutional frameworks, and how certain knowledge remains forever unproduced, not because it is hidden or suppressed or forbidden, but because the structures through which knowledge is legitimated and funded and published do not contain a category for it. It is the negative space in the architecture of knowing. It is what falls through the gaps, and so the curved brickwork remains. It remains in the photograph that Henry Flather took at Baker Street in 1862, patient arches of precisely fitted blocks extending into darkness on either side of the frame. It remains in his 64 photographs of the Metropolitan District Railway, taken in the late 1860s at sites across a different section of London, showing the same structural elements recurring with the same geometry at location after location. It remains in the engravings that the Illustrated London News published throughout 1861 and 1862, detailed depictions by skilled artists working from direct observation at construction sites that were open to public view. It remains in the maintenance logs where Victorian engineers noted sections of tunnel that required clearing rather than construction. It remains in the financial records where the Metropolitan Railway achieved the seemingly impossible economics of building a railway beneath the most expensive city on earth for approximately what it would have cost to build across open countryside. It remains in the spoil accounts where more than half the excavated material vanishes from the documentary record between the trenches and the documented receiving sites. It remains in the sealed passages that branch off from the operational network, passages that appear on no public map and serve no acknowledged purpose, passages that Victorian workers walled shut not because they were excavating new routes, but because they were closing connections to old ones that the railway did not need and that no one was prepared to explain. The shape persists, the curve that requires no template, because it follows a geometry that is self-evidently optimal, the radius that serves no engineering purpose identifiable in Victorian railway specifications, but that recurs with identical dimensions across the original network as though every arch were stamped from a master pattern. The consistency of brick size and mortar composition across sections that, if built by different work crews at different times as the official narrative states, should show the normal variation that characterizes any large-scale construction project employing thousands of workers over multiple years. The brickwork does not show this variation. It is uniform in a way that suggests either a single manufacturing source and a single construction campaign, or a single pre-existing structure that the Victorian workers found already complete. We called it a railway. We called it a triumph of Victorian engineering, a monument to industrial progress, proof of what human beings could accomplish with iron determination and gunpowder and sweat and the labor of thousands of men working 18-hour shifts in darkness beneath the greatest city in the world. We wrote this story in our textbooks and our museum exhibits and our commemorative plaques and our anniversary publications, and we taught it to our children, and we celebrated its anniversaries with speeches and special train services and postage stamps, and we never noticed that the images showed something other than what we had been told to see in them. Perhaps it does not matter what we call things. Perhaps the names we give to structures and formations and historical events have no bearing on what they actually are. Perhaps the language of construction that we draped over what was clearly a process of excavation and discovery was simply the vocabulary that made sense to a civilization that believed itself to be building the future, not uncovering the past. Perhaps the curved brickwork that appears in the earliest images of the London Underground is exactly what the official narrative says it is: temporary shoring, subsequently lined with permanent masonry, built by Victorian workers using Victorian techniques and Victorian materials to Victorian specifications in a Victorian city for Victorian passengers. Or perhaps we are living in a city whose foundations we do not understand, walking above tunnels that remember a time before our records begin, traveling beneath streets that were laid over passages we did not build and whose builders we cannot name. Perhaps every morning millions of passengers descend into a darkness that is older than the civilization that uses it, passing through shapes that were waiting beneath the surface when the first Roman merchant sailed up the Thames and established the trading post that would become Londinium, shapes that were waiting when the Saxons built their wooden halls above them, shapes that were waiting when the Normans raised the tower and the medieval city grew around its walls, shapes that were waiting when the Great Fire consumed the surface city and left the underground passages untouched, shapes that will be waiting when the last human departure is recorded and the city falls silent and the tunnels endure alone beneath the emptied streets in a darkness that is not empty but merely patient. We do not know, and the architecture of how we produce knowledge, the institutional mandates, the funding structures, the disciplinary boundaries, the peer review systems, the professional incentive frameworks that determine what can be studied and what cannot, what can be asked and what is unaskable, ensures that we may never know. Not because the question is unanswerable, not because the evidence does not exist, not because the technology to settle the matter definitively is unavailable or unaffordable or technically challenging, but because the question is unaskable, falling forever into the gap between disciplines, between mandates, between the categories that determine what is and is not legitimate inquiry in a civilization that believes it has already mapped the totality of its own past. The brickwork curves into darkness. The images preserve what the image makers did not fully understand. And beneath a city of 9 million people, in the spaces between the tracks and behind the walls, and in the sealed passages that branch off into directions no modern surveyor has followed, something waits in the silence between the trains, patient as it has always been, patient, unchanged by the names we give it, indifferent to our certainties and our doubts alike. We built a map of the past and called it complete. We built a map of the underground and called it the tube map. But maps are not territories. Maps are simplifications, abstractions, useful fictions that show us what we need to see and hide what we have decided is not worth showing. And there are passages beneath London that appear on no map. Passages that curve exactly like the tunnels in those 1862 photographs and those 1861 engravings. Passages that were sealed by Victorian workers who left no written explanation for their closing. Passages that may extend farther than we have ever measured into a darkness that has never known the light of a surveyor's lamp or the beam of a maintenance worker's torch. What else have we walked past without seeing? What else have we named without understanding? What else waits beneath the surfaces we consider solid, in the silences we consider empty, in the histories we consider closed? The question is not what the Victorians found beneath the streets of London when they started digging in 1860. The question is how much of what we think we know about this city, about its past, about the ground beneath our feet, is history, and how much is simply the shape of what we never thought to ask.